Okay, so everybody should see my beginning slide, which is making explosions that don't blow. So explanations. What is this really all about? I have a very long history in education as well as the entertainment industry, AI, i.e., sorry, game or films and television. So a lot of the perspective that I'm going to be bringing to this talk are relevant to cross-platform, so games, film, television, but a lot of the resources that I have that I will be showing will be film-centric. So just so you know, there's a lot of theory in here, there's a lot of ideas in here, and I do believe that it's going to benefit everybody. So a bit about me. Why am I the one here talking to you? So I have 15 years of experience in visual effects, animation, learning and development, and production. So basically that takes my career back to about 2010, where I left education and went to digital domain and worked there for a few years, tumultuous years, but still very informative years. I then left to go to Sony Pictures ImageWorks, where I had the pleasure of working with some of the most amazing artists in the world and discovered a true passion for Houdini in that respect. But my passion for explosions, I was thinking about that this morning. My passion for explosions goes a little bit further back than that. Not practical, never really blew stuff up in my backyard, even though I'm from rural Alberta. And there was plenty of opportunities for that. But I remember my first experience with a piece of 3D software, which was a program called Infinity. And I mean, we're going back to 1996 right now. So probably before many of you were even on this planet. And one of our first exercises in this piece of software, Infinity, was to model a train of some kind. And I mean, we're talking basic primitive objects, nothing spectacular. If you've ever seen Reboot from years gone by, you'll be familiar with the overall capabilities of 3D at that time. So the first thing we did was model a train, and I hated that train. Oh, I hated that train. It was arduous. It didn't look that great. So I was kind of going through the drop downs in Infinity at the time, and I noticed glory. There was a drop down and it said explosion, right? So, or explode, I think was what it was called. And my insides got a little excited because I'm like, yes, finally, this is it. So I grabbed the train, did the drop down, hit explode, and it was the worst explosion ever. And it really was meant for logo design. So if you had a logo and you wanted to appear as if it was reassembling, you would take it, explode it, and then play it backwards. But it would basically take the entire cylinders, the cubes, everything that was constructed on this train, and just kind of move them away from another. So I was decimated. Like, this is not explosions. This is not what I was expecting. So fast forward a couple of weeks, I think, in the program, and we got introduced to a program called Electric Image. And Electric Image was massive in the industry in the 90s. The liquid chrome effect, or sorry, liquid nitrogen effect from Terminator 2, the explosion effect from Terminator 2, those were both done with Electric Image. And specifically, the explosion was utilizing a tool called Mr. Nitro. And Mr. Nitro was literally a little stick of dynamite cylinder, let's be honest, that you stuck someplace in your scene, and it basically shredded all of your polys to their triangles, right? Just took them all back down to their basic tessellation levels. That was better. It's still, by today's standards, still not exactly perfect, but I was super excited about that. So I've been an admirer and a huge exploding guy for a very, very long time. So I was involved with about 40 feature films between Digital Domain and Sony. Some of the more popular ones we'll talk about. I have 25 plus years of post-secondary teaching experience. I started using Maya beta 0.9, which is prior to public release. I had a copy of it. I got it from a friend of a friend of a friend. Don't go there. We all do things. It wasn't out, so I needed to have access to it. But changed my world, changed everything for multiple reasons. That, I mean, this was a 6-hour talk. I could go into it, but it's not. So many years of experience in film, years of experience in education. So here's some of the films that I was involved with. Some of my favorites, I think. Edge of Tomorrow, by far one of my favorite experiences, working with it was a fairly small team, but a massive endeavor. And, you know, child of the 80s, Tom Cruise, over and over again. It's pretty cool. Spider-Man series were always interesting for multiple reasons. Being challenged by Marvel constantly is a spectacular endeavor. I put Love, Death, and Robots on here because this was really a different departure for me in my career, where I'd never touched Unreal Engine before that. And for season 3, we worked on In Vaulted Halls Entombed, which was our very first fully Unreal realized piece. It was 15 minutes, and it was a challenge. So Sea Beast, just personally love that film. Spider-Verse films changed everything, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. And then, of course, everybody's digging K-pop right now. I left ImageWorks in December of last year, just before Christmas, so I wasn't there for the cherry on top of K-pop, but I was there for a lot of the initial development. So now I'm at Think Tank. Now I am heading up the online Houdini program and loving every minute of it, because the students have been spectacular, the work has been amazing, and all of this are things that I'm going to continue sharing with everybody today. So it's not about that, it's about explosions. Okay, so everybody knows what I'm talking about when I mention an explosion, right? But explosions can be so much more than just the violence and the destruction of it, right? These can be metaphoric. They can lead to different ideas, and that's really where the best explosions come from, right? This is where it's not just about grabbing a piece of geometry. It's not about grabbing that toy train or that train that you modeled and then hitting a button that says explode, right? It gets you a certain level, right? Even with Houdini right now, it'll get you to a certain level, but there's a nuance and an art to it. And that's really what the focus of this talk is going to be about. So at their essence, explosions represent a release of energy, right? That release of energy comes into collision with multiple other forces that are arranged around it. But that energy can manifest in many ways. It can manifest in color, light, dust, pixels, and emotion, which can be a really cool part. So these explosions can represent a visual metaphor, right? They can symbolize shock, revelation. Everywhere, I had the name of this one down, and I was going to use a part of it. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, I believe was the name of the film. If you've only seen it once, go watch it again, because it's ripe with the metaphorics of how explosions can actually be used. It's very cool. They can be used as a narrative tool, right? Beyond signifying endings, they can mark beginnings, transitions, right? Discovery. Very cool. And then impact for emotion, right? So again, that can be an emotional revelation, and these can be signified in different ways. So I've broadened the scope of what an explosion can actually be, and how it can actually be utilized. So at its core, it's about energy. So energy makes the experience visceral, right? Explosions are about making the invisible visible, right? They turn tension, build up, and release into motion and light, right? So that's a key part of this. Style. The style of that emotion, that explosion, makes you remember it, right? And I think, I'll be going through some of the more memorable explosions that I've experienced through my career, as well as personal explorations of explosions. But the style is your design choices, right? So again, it goes beyond just hitting a button. And I want to take this away from buttonology. So I want to take it away from, how to do things specifically in a piece of software. But I am going to lean heavily in Houdini because that is the state of the industry right now. And storytelling really makes it matter, right? Which will bring up something that that I think everybody needs to think about when they're dealing with an explosion. It has to be contextual. It has to show, there's something that's happened resulting in that explosion, right? Just showing an explosion in a demo reel or something like that isn't quite enough, right? The viewers need that buildup, right? And as an audience, we require that buildup. So we'll talk about that extensively as well. All right, so we're going to look at two different kinds of explosions. So there's a stylized explosion versus a more realistic explosion. Sometimes you use a bit of both, right? So you'll even find that when we start looking at some of the Spider-Verse content, it does hinge itself in reality and in physics, but it's heavily overlaid with stylization to make it that storytelling element, to make it more appealing. So starting off with realistic or photorealistic explosions. Now, anytime you mention the word photorealistic, it takes way more time. It takes your budget up. It takes your processing power up, right? It's about replicating a real world event, right? So every single aspect of this has to be scrutinized, right? So you're looking at smoke, shock waves, debris, so on and so forth. Right, the tools that we would normally use for this in the industry would be primarily Houdini and its pyro effects, as well as some of the other aspects of Houdini. So physically based rendering, volume shading, realistic light scattering, black body emission, so on and so forth. We would lean, in general, we lean really, really strongly into real world reference. Right, even with stylization, we still require that foundation in reality because that's what the audience requires. So, real world references are drawn from like nuclear test footage, demolition records, military archives. I have an external drive that is purely for reference that I store. It's not just explosions, otherwise, that could be crazy, but I have an entire reference drive. I'd pick it up right now, but it's tethered a little bit too tightly, so I can't get it into frame. So the purpose of the photorealistic explosions is immersion and to increase the stakes of what's actually happening. Danger, consequences, overall narrative gravity. So popular example, one of my favorites, and again, if we were to fast forward this clip and only look at it in terms of the realistic explosion, then the gravity might not be there. But either you've seen this film and you know what's happening and what's happened, or at least this gives you the context in terms of what's happened. Now, none of the videos that I play are going to have any audio because I want to focus on the visuals right now. It's all about taking it in. And I recommend that. When you're in your analysis phase of anything, make sure that you are focusing on the intent, focusing on what you really need, not necessarily on the full package of enjoyment. So this was a practical explosion, obviously. This wide shot was an augmented practical explosion, but they literally had this building, I think it was in Chicago, that they were given permission to destroy. But that's, again, I'm showing this because this is as photorealistic as it gets because it's recorded content. And a lot of times you're going to look at things and go, wow, that looks really cool. It looks photoreal, but it's recorded on a backlot. Early days for explosions, they were really, really hard to get the renderings out properly. So I remember frame by framing it through the asteroid explosion in Armageddon and being like, wow, this is really cool. And then I was talking to, later on in my career, I got to talk to some people that worked on that explosion, and they were like, oh yeah, no, we went out on the back lot and we blew up the asteroid. We physically blew it up, and then we did augment it and map elements to cards and things just to make it a little bit, to accentuate it a bit more and to give the director a bit more control. But for the longest time, a lot of effects were just card based. So if it was flame, fire, smoke, debris, they would just map that effect on a card, and it worked well. In fact, you're going to see the same process on Spider-Verse, and I have some examples of that. Okay, so then we have stylized approaches. And even though it's stylized, doesn't mean that it's any less difficult to do. In fact, stylization without a strong foundation in art design can often come across not believable, right? And the whole thing with me and with every discipline I ever teach is really rooted in believability, right? If it's your aim is to go for a more realistic look, then as long as you hit that believability metric, you're fine, okay? But again, stylized, you're trying to fit a world, you're trying to fit a moment within that world. So actual definition, expressive exaggeration, emphasis on style, clarity, and emotional tone. Core tools and techniques are hand-drawn, right? Hand-drawn doesn't necessarily mean drawn on paper anymore. Lots of times you're using some different software to do so. Shape language is imperative. So for any of you who haven't done a thorough kind of exploration of visual storytelling or anything like that, I'm going to name drop a book. It's called The Visual Story by Bruce Block. And that, to me, is the epitome of visual storytelling education. If you don't have it, find it. I don't get anything from it. It's not me benefiting, but you. I picked up my first copy in like 2003, 2004, and it changed the way that I work. So I highly recommend it. So color palette can be obviously a little bit more controlled, but you can have a bit more fun with it too. So the purpose for stylized explosions is to emphasize clarity in terms of high-speed sequences and really to push emotion, right? So I know many of you have probably seen the last one, but I'm pretty sure not many of you have seen this one. Okay, so some of you are going, what the, look at the quality there. So I just showed you a tiny amount of this short film by Michel Gagne called Prelude to Eden. The story is amazing. The story is very cool. It's about this evolution of a creature, and to this point where they basically get to the point of mutual destruction. So a very, very heavy kind of film. The effects are all hand-drawn by one gentleman. His name is Michel Gagne, and he is he's amazing. He was one of the effects animators on The Iron Giant. I worked with a good friend of his named Joseph Gilland at Vancouver Film School when I was there. He was actually one of my mentors. And to this day, Joseph Gilland has a book series called Elemental Magic, which I highly, highly recommend you pick up if you're anywhere close to effects in general. But it's really cool to see how everything I'm going to be talking about today is represented there. But that was just a very, very basic look at it. Okay, so tools of the trade. What we're going to talk about here is a little bit more about Houdini, right? So I'm not going to crack open Houdini and run through an effects simulation or anything crazy like that. There's tutorials. Everybody's gone to some level of school, and you've probably seen the tools in action. I really like to focus on the thought process and looking at how things need to be considered, how they need to actually work, right? Again, anybody can push a button, right? But it's us that brings the craft. We bring the art into these designs. So, okay, so in modern effects pipeline, Houdini, it really is the fulcrum. It's the nucleus. It has been for a very long time. So because of its ability to replicate physically accurate simulations, it goes beyond film. It goes into multiple other areas and arenas, but we're going to focus on it for this particular class. So in Houdini, you're looking at using procedural pyro simulations, particles, VOPs, pops, right, so on and so forth. These simulations, right? So we've done explosions, smoke portals, glitch effects. I would say anytime you've seen an explosion in a feature film, it was either practical or it had something to do with the pyrosolver or VOPs inside of Houdini. So as an example, right, we have the Collider explosion, right, and the Kingpin portal from the Spider-Verse movies. So they both used Houdini Pyro and VDB volumes to create the effects that we actually had. And it says here, stylized remapping of density, temperature fields, and the I think it's the Ditko effect, which we dubbed it as the halftone dots that were showing up on surfaces. Effects artists often generated the full 3D sim in Houdini, so the simulations looked a whole lot more crisp and clean, and then we spent a lot of time drawing over them, painting over them. So we would export those AOVs, curvature, velocity, and depth, and then use Nuke in many ways to flatten them and create some stylization. I have some examples of that. Glitch passes were generated in Houdini using geometry-based effects too. So, so here's an example from a film I think everybody's seen, but if you haven't, go watch it. It's pretty awesome. So again, all of the different layers, all of the different passes that go into this, the hand-drawn shapes. Now, what's really, really interesting about this, and I wanted to show this specifically for this presentation, is how I mentioned earlier, right? A lot of these effects, I'm going to go back to about here. A lot of these effects that you see in the films were not necessarily volumetric effects. They were volumetric effects that were then flattened and then procedurally placed on cards for the shot that we needed. Now, super interesting about this is, remember I showed just a few minutes ago, I showed that short, Prelude to Eden by Michel Gagne. Michel Gagne drew these explosions, right? Not a lot of people realize that or know that, but he was contracted early on in the show to come in and draw multiple explosions for us, right? And he would just do those all in 2D. And then we used those 2D explosions on cards to accentuate and make some of the large explosions you see. So when you look at this mammoth explosion going on through here, right? A lot of this it's not about simulation, right? It's about the moment. It's about the accentuating that moment through shapes and through stylizations and motion and pattern. So it goes well beyond just calling it an explosion. Another example here. So this is actually going to show, starting with that 3D volumetric explosion, and then how LookDev would deliver 2D layers, right, that they could draw over. Now, it's a challenge because I'm just going to kind of play through it because there's no audio anyway. So the challenge really is staying on style, right? Because you can see there's a fairly realistic simulation going on in the background with the smoke and with these little mini explosions. And then the 2D artist is going to come in, and LookDev artists are going to come in and just try to accentuate it. They need to, it's a ton of work here because they need to be restricted, or they are restricted by the original CG explosions to an extent. but they really, really want to push it. So you can see here, right, the background. A lot of this was initial explosion, right? So this was what was created through that initial volumetric pass. And then this is all the extensions and the additions that went onto it. And one more here. It was a similar process that was used with, again, the artist being the true final say. So that's the reason why I didn't want to have this be a buttonology lesson on Houdini, because everybody can learn that, right? There's amazing tutorials, but this is what you really have to pay your attention to make your explosions truly sing, to make them dance and do hula hoops, really. So this is a bit shorter. One of the first sequences that we actually worked on in the film, a lot of our look dev and exploration came from the Guggenheim sequence, or GUG sequence. And you can see this, it's beautiful, right? If I back this up just for a second, I love this. I love how this looks. This looks incredible. And then if you look at the actual shot, so here's what it appeared in the final film. There's these bursts of light, and you can just get a hint of it through the background, right? You can see it a little bit better over on the right-hand side. It's there, but it's so like, it's not in your face, but it just adds to the experience of what we're actually seeing. So it's just so cool. I remember when we were working on, why is the name? Suicide Squad, the first Suicide Squad film. The Enchantress, towards the end, she's created this portal, kind of like the whole thing came across as this undulating fractal pattern that she was summoning, kind of thing. And I remember watching that fractal pattern in dailies for like, it felt like hours, but just loving it. It was beautiful, the undulation of it, how the whole thing was coming together. And then in the final film, there's a massive blur put on top of it, because we don't want him to pay attention to that. We want him to pay attention to Enchantress. But there's so many layers and so many effects that go into the shots that happen that they're just inklings. Like, you feel them in some cases more than you see them, it's truly incredible. All right. So let's talk about explosions. We're going to look at the language of explosions. So understanding the anatomy, ignition, expansion, dissipation. And in most cases, these are settings. These are parameters that you're going to see in Houdini and other applications. So it's nice to be able to take it away from a slider and think about it in a practical sense. All right. So every explosion is universal, right? There's a cycle that goes on. And again, I'm going to use explosion as just a general term now, but we go back to that first slide where I talked about how these could be narrative, how it could be metaphorical, right? All of this comes back into play, right? So every explosion starts with an ignition, which is the birth of that explosion. So it's the trigger. In VFX, this could appear as a flash frame, lens flare, rapid particle emission, but narratively it carries a symbolic weight. The release of, it could be conflict, revelation, creative spark of things to come. Expansion, right? So this is the life. We have the birth through the ignition. We have the life through the expansion. So expansion is, the peak of intensity, right? Cinematically, it's the moment of spectacle, the impact of things. And then we have dissipation, which represents death or decay, smoke trails, debris. Fate isn't important as the blast. It tells the story of the aftermath, right? What are the consequences of what's actually happened? So I didn't want to completely leave games out of the situation. And when I was doing my research for this talk, I found this. And I thought, this is really, really cool, because it, through a different style, shows exactly what we were just talking about. Right? So in game, we have that, right? But we have this pause in the middle where you can when you can peruse and you can walk through the debris and you can experience this explosion from all different kinds of angles, which I thought was really cool. But it represents the same thing. We have the birth, we have the life, and then eventually, as we stop walking around here in a second, you have the death, right? The overall settling, the consequences of what's happened. So I just thought that that was really cool to show that, again, even in games, we're utilizing the same kinds of methodologies. So elements, right? What I find when I looked, so at ImageWorks, a big part of my job was also, wasn't a recruiter, but I ran the internship programs for about 10 years. And whenever I saw an effects film, and to this day when I see effects shorts, what is normally missing is the idea of understanding elements, understanding how things need to break. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time here because hopefully you're taking notes. I know everybody's going to have this recording afterwards, but it's kind of like, you know, you do a demo reel talk and you say, these are the elements of a demo reel, and you never think about them. This is the stuff that I know is there and everybody is considering, but you really have to explore it. So object anatomy and material identity, right? What is it made of? What are you destroying and what is it made of here, right? So the physical identity determines how it reacts when the energy passes through it, right? So that's why it's so vitally important. And in this case, you know, you can classify this object anatomy in several ways. So I've got rigid here. There's soft, composite, granular, and liquid, right? So all of these are popular building blocks of buildings, things that you might want to actually destroy. So in the case of rigid, dealing with that metal, the trellises, the framework that might go on in there. Cloth, right? So how does the cloth react to whatever's happening in the explosion? Composite material. So this is usually your woods and areas like that. Granular. Sometimes if you're talking sand, you're not close enough frame-wise to see this, but it can come across as just a slight distortion in the light. And we will talk about light later on. And then if you're really suicidal, you want to throw some liquids in there too to make the explosion really crazy. So each object carries an invisible blueprint. It's mass, density, and tension zones. Right? These determine how it behaves under force, and you really have to start to understand this. So mass of an object, this defines the weight and inertia, how much energy is needed to move or stop that object. Okay. Again, think about the difference of mass between a bowling ball and a golf ball or a tennis ball, right? Going back to some very simple ideas, right? So the amount of energy that's needed to move a bowling ball is way different than a balloon, for instance. So you've got to understand the mass of the objects that are involved with that explosion. Density determines how tightly the matter it's packed in, right? How pressure or the shock will travel through that object. And then the tension zones are the stress points, right? So this is where the failure begins. In an elastic material, really, really difficult to try to ascertain where that tension zone might be. But in a rigid object, a rigid material like this, it's the breakdown of the construction of it, right? So if you're dealing with cement, I don't know how many of you have dealt with cement, but it's basically water, gravel, sand, all kind of brought together. And if you don't have the perfect mixture of that, you do actually introduce little pockets of air that can become those stress points. Now, some of you are thinking, wow, some of you might at this point be going, man, he's crazy to think at this level. Others, and I'm hoping you're slanted this way, are going, wow, cool. I never really thought about it in that context. So your job here is to act like that scientist in some way, right? You're not constructing it. You're not the one responsible for creating it in a lot of ways, but you have to understand how it was created. And I think that's missing a lot of times from demo reels that show explosions, right? They look cool, but beyond that, do they make sense? Are they believable? They look cool, believable, right? So looking at surface versus core. So as a modeler, right, you tend to focus on this, right? When you first start with a 3D piece of software, I would say, model a house. Here's what I would get, right? But do you understand the structure? Like the effects artist out there would do research now on vinyl siding, on glass. What's the door made out of? What are the shingles made out of, right? So at a surface level, this is how the audience first gets its glimpse into this, right? It dictates, light, shadow, color, how textures, reflectivity. So, and in many cases, this is the showpiece of that moment before detonation, right? So to get a real understanding of what it is. Simulation, surface attributes control visual feedback, specular highlights, micro detail breakup, how stress becomes visible, cracks, so on and so forth. If this is an older building, this is obviously kind of like a new building, but if this is an older building, right? How is that setting up expectations for the explosion to come? So this is the Houdini expectation that I would have, where if I'm going to destroy this building, I'm going to go to this level and I'm going to start to understand all of these pieces that go into it, right? So is it made out of wood? Is it made out of metal? Is it made out of brick, right? The overall makeup of rooms going on in here. And the last thing that I haven't even really talked about yet is what's causing this explosion, right? Is this a gas explosion inside the house? Has somebody thrown a piece of dynamite through a window? Like what causes that explosion? Because every catalyst will have a different effect on all of these elements that you've identified, right? This is not easy. Never been easy stuff. So here we go. This is the harmony of it, connecting appearance and physics. So this is taking that initial appearance and then trying to run it through a simulation. Convincing simulation is not just about breaks, but why it breaks that way. Surface cues should anticipate core behavior, right? Chipped paint suggests brittleness, stretched fibers foreshadow tearing, so on and so forth. Now, I want to call everybody's attention to this image because I find this hilarious. Everybody's all over AI right now, right? AI is the, I find people either love it or you hate it, right? I would say that I'm in stage 4 AI. Stage 1 was fear, and then I've gone through multiple levels, so now I'm on stage 4. And this has helped me with stage 4 because, yes, this is AI. Right. What I did was I took this first image, so this image that I'd created, and I said, blow this up. Right. Put it into Midjourney, and I said, destroy this building. And you know what Midjourney said? Nope, I'm not going to do it because something in the programming was not allowing it to recreate explosions. So I had to do some bells and whistles, and this was after about 40 minutes of massaging my prompts to figure out what was going to go on. And I don't even like this, okay? But I had to abandon it. Sometime it's CBB, could be better, but you hear that a lot in the industry. Nothing's ever finished. You just abandon it because you can't get that far. But this isn't believable, right? It looks cool as an image, right? And the first time you look at it, it looks cool. But anybody in this room who is analytical will go, what the heck is going on there? Hey, why is the roof not collapsing, right? But the level of that destruction, I mean, maybe we're mid-destruction right now, so this is showing the whole piece lifting off. But I would expect way more fracturing to be going on in here than what's being depicted. And look at the chunks of debris that are in here, right? So these massive rocks, where are they from? Right? Where did those actually come from? Like, let's go back here. Yes, we have this large pad foundation. This was the original image, right? That I had prompted to do the explosion. But this is concrete. There's concrete underneath. If The detonation device is above the concrete, it's going to crater. So it's going to create some kind of a hole underneath. But the level of sizes of these boulders, this is not accurate. Okay. So you're not going to tell me AI is going to take my job away from me, because I know that this isn't good enough. If I really wanted to polish this and get it to the right level, I would need to speak the language of explosions very, very fluently to be able to do this right. Okay. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the language of explosions. So cool. All right. So forces that will come into play. Every motion tells a story of forces at play, whether subtle or violent. It's the interactions define how energy moves through matter. So collisions, right? Impact that transfers momentum, the instant of contact and reaction. Okay. So when two objects collide, in the case of an explosion, the explosion itself generates the energy that repulses or propels things away from it. But what happens when the wood comes in contact with glass, right? Or the wood comes in contact with shingles or stone, so on and so forth, right? That's a big part of it, right? Friction. This is resistance that slows or reshapes motion, right? It can sometimes create additional heat or even drag and decay. Wind, right? Directional forces that can sculpt the flow, bending, twisting, revealing form, overall pressure, right? So going back to the density of an object, right? How much pressure is required for that particular object to be destroyed. And centrifugal, which is the outward versus inward motion. Different kinds of motion, types of motion. We have linear, which is a direct path. We have oscillating motion. There's chaotic motion, as well as explosive motion, which is probably closer these are the results. I find these are more often deemed the catalysts. So linear and oscillating create the event, whereas chaotic and explosive are the results of that event. And then trails, right? And this does kind of get more into I don't know, I can't even say that, because in some of the Doctor Strange Avengers style explosions, they do lean into the mystical in a lot of ways. So I can't just say it's more stylized, but it is always there for a reason and for a purpose. So different kinds. We've got, sculpted motion paths, story energy over time from its birth or spawn point to its death. And then well-designed motion can carry physical logic as well as emotional rhythm. Okay, so destruction logic, how things break. So everything based on, like I said, based on the mass, based on the density, based on its overall method of construction or creation, will have things about it that could cause it to be brittle in this case. Right. And this in a lot of ways is based on the wall strength, right? So how thick the wall is. And it really does inform how certain things will just be destroyed. If it's ductile, how does it stretch or bend? And this is mostly in your metals, clay forms, things like that. Layered, how does it peel or flake? Wood, plaster. Wood is hard, right? If you're ever looking and trying to destroy something, look at how the wood needs to interact. How is the wood actually connected, right? What kind of force is required to break that apart, right? And then composite, which is more like concrete or reinforced structures. So this is brand new. I mean, brand new to me. I stumbled upon it yesterday, but it was the new trailer for Zootopia 2. And there's a destruction scene, right? So I wanted to just capture it, and I wanted to talk through it just a little bit here. It's very, very quick. It's part of the trailer, but I think it's a bigger part of the film. But the whole idea of believability for the genre, believability for that point in time. So when you first look at this, it looks pretty cool, right? Like the wood feels like it's behaving like wood. It's falling apart. It's obeying gravity, things like that. But if you do a pause on it, you kind of look at what we actually have here for structure. It doesn't have to be super detailed in terms of like the textural detail that's going on in there. It's more important to have it feel like that material is falling apart, right? So just kind of watching it again. Wood is hard, right? You want to replicate that fracturing and the kind of falling apart of things. Okay, so I was watching the trailer and I was immediately drawn to this, and I thought, yeah, I should throw that in the presentation because it's all defined by the genre. It's all defined by the overall stylization that's required. Cool. So fracture patterns. Oh, in psychology, this is the other thing. And I'm not making this up. I'm not doing this because I want to push a new envelope. This is there, right? When you watch a film, when you play a game, these decisions are, somebody sat around a table, been in a meeting for hours to scrutinize some of these decisions that are being made, right? So fracture patterns that you're going to see in certain kinds of materials. Now, you're not going to get this kind of fracture pattern. You're not going to get radial cracks so easily in wood, right? If you think about a stump of wood, looking at it from the top down and looking at the life patterns, the radial patterns in it, if you had an axe and you were to hit that dead center in the middle, you would create some radial cracks in there. But there's a tremendous amount of force that would be required. And we don't see stumps as often in demolition, right? We see that more as the 2x4s, 2x10s kind of thing. But radial cracks can represent like sudden violent forces, shock, trauma, spiral fractures, stress tension, like endurance, shattered fragmentation, chaos, collapse, loss of control, and then clean splits, right? Clarity of release. So again, I know that a lot of software out there is capable of shattering. I've done this stuff in Houdini, or sorry, in Unreal as well, and it doesn't do a half bad job. Everything does it better than Maya, to be completely honest, because I have done shattering in Unreal and then brought it back into either Houdini or into Maya for the shot that I was working on. But you use the tool that works the best in certain ways. And I did find that in Unreal, the fracture patterns were a little bit easier to define than they were in Maya. The budget demanded that I couldn't use Houdini at that time. So your impact zone is important, right? So the secondary debris, the zone reveals the source of the explosion, right? And again, that kind of just goes back to what caused this, right? It's cause and result. So it's all about controlled chaos, right? Destruction logic, realistic destruction blends order and disorder. Cracks follow physics, composition guides the eye. So just a couple of images that I grabbed quickly offline. When you're looking at any kind of destruction, any kind of explosions, nothing, and I've said this before, nothing is easy, right? It's your critical eye of going in and exploring, pulling things apart, and really just really dissecting it to how it needs to be handled. Sometimes you pack for explosions inside of Houdini, you forgot, right? Maybe you didn't build it the technical way. I remember on the first new Spider-Man live action film where the Vulture is taking out the pillars in the warehouse. We were using that as a test shot for new Houdini artists coming into the studio. And one of the things, like the pillars had rebar embedded in them, right? So there was an aspect of how the cement would cling to the rebar during those collision moments, right? but very, very cool, right? That level of detail is going on, because if you watch the shot, you don't see that. You don't necessarily see the rebar, but it affects the motion of the debris coming off of those pillars. So the goal is, chaos that feels intentional, destruction that serves narrative. And it's not just about making, like, it's got to look good and look cool, but I think it has to serve higher purposes than that. So in that respect, right, these are some of the visceral semiotic things that you can think about with fractures. So your origin point is can symbolize cause or trauma. Crack density is emotional fragmentation, directionality, repression, kind of thing. So again, you could actually, and the more I did this presentation, the more I started thinking about how cool it might be to make a film, a short film, not a film, a short film, using a lot of what I'm talking about, but symbolically towards a certain moment in time. So anyway, that's me just getting out there. I'm always thinking of films to do. And edge sharpness can, associate with melancholy, acceptance, so on and so forth. So we've gone a little bit of time without seeing anything. I remember watching this and loving this explosion. But I want you to kind of think about it in context with everything we just talked about. It's all relevant. So we needed this shot, right? It's kind of over that slaps you in the face, the catalyst of this explosion. Okay. So we then see that moment of creation, the moment of initial ignition, and then the full explosion that goes on. So the debris in here, it feels believable. Now this house, when they shot this explosion, was empty, right? There was no furniture inside of it. There was nothing in there. So this second shot that we see now was staged, right? So this was all, they didn't want to take the nice furniture that was in the nice house and destroy that. So obviously they've just decorated this with stuff that they got at like Value Village, or no, it's American, so it wouldn't have been Value Village, but you know what I mean, right? It's all sleight of hand. Filmmaking is all an illusion, and what you show in one shot may not necessarily be the exact same assets used in the second shot. So if you're getting to that point and you've modeled a building or you've modeled something that you want to destroy, but you hit that button and it looks okay, but it doesn't feel like it has enough stuff to it, consider packing it with additional information. Just throw some new stuff in there that would logically exist in that space, right? You don't have to go back in time and recreate the building realistically, okay? You can throw content in there that will then make it, that will accentuate it. So it's a little trick that you can use because it's way less time consuming. It's than trying to go back to the beginning and rebuild everything from scratch. Okay, so talking about color and light, just briefly here, just checking time check. Ooh, it's almost 12. Wow, this is going a long time. Color and light, right? It's not just the surface aesthetics, it's the carriers of energy, right? So you can tell a lot about the explosion and the ramifications of the explosion through the color shifts that go on. There's the traditional color shift, right? Usually, from white hot through red, orange, yellow, so on and so forth, or sorry, yellow, orange, red, right? But if you can kind of imagine taking the colors and doing some different things to it. So from Game of Thrones, we have this little image here where the flames, which I know is not quite explosion, but is it, right? It's an explosive force coming out of the mouth of a creature. So what do these colors signify, and how can you use them, even not subconsciously, but to different effect, right? So blue usually, is purity, precision, scientific control, which kind of flies in the face. It's a stark contrast to the chaos that a dragon would be doing. Green, normally associated with corruption, magic, toxicity. And the thing is with any of these, so white, purity, transcendence, and then purple is usually more of an arcane, alien, divine energy. Now, a little bit, like just the tiniest amount about color, you get to be the owner of that narrative, right? You can define what that color represents in whatever you're doing. So if you do want to take any of these and flip them on their head and try to make green about purity, how do you define that? And that might take you a little bit more time to design into your destruction shots, your explosions, because you don't have the build up to it. This is something much more suited to a feature film. So when you get to that level of being a supervisor or being a visual effects supervisor, in that case, you might have say in this. So these are little nuggets to store in the back of your brain and then retrieve them later on. But some very cool ideas in terms of how you can use color in your narrative. Different kinds of palettes that you can look at. So I've got 3 examples there: a neon, pastel, and a monochrome explosion. All of them based on the same general concept. Again, I used AI for these. So it's the same prompt, just slight modifications in terms of what I was asking for, right? And AI is actually quite a nice tool when you need to do exploration. I was having this conversation the other day with somebody, and I said that essentially AI has replaced Google search for me, right? It's my new Google search. I don't do, I'll use it a lot for ideation and for working through problems. So if I want to know the structure of a standard, 10-foot office building, type that in and it will retrieve, it will bring back a list of objects that could be found in there, materials that it could be made out of, right? And from there, I can begin my exploration. Whereas normally, you might be going out on the internet using Google search, doing searches one by one for different pieces. So it has sped up my ideation process significantly, but it hasn't impacted the creative side for me. So these can, they can accentuate realism, be symbolic, there's surrealism to them. I don't know necessarily how beyond, shooting something in complete black and white, monochrome would work, but it's out there, right? Explosions don't always need flames to convey energy, right? Light alone can do the job for you. And I've got some brilliant examples of this. A burst of pure white light can feel as explosive as fire, right? Expanding rings or ripples, same thing. Smooth gradients, as well as light pulses, dynamic flickers or rhythmic flickers that you can implement in there. So some good examples of this. Again, back to Terminator 2 in 1991. There is a shot, I'm only showing part of this, but there is a shot after this finishes where it does show the actual decimation that was used that was done in electric image, but this is accentuating the flash frame, right? So established, boom, right? Don't even really see the explosion. We do after this. We see some nuclear clouds. We see some plumes, but 1991, right? Think about the state of the industry and the state of effects at that time. Yeah, it's crazy what people were able to achieve. And this moment is really being sold. If we go back to Linda Hamilton here, right? I'm not going to be able to pause it right in time, but it's that moment right there that sells the explosion, okay? And budgetary considerations always have to be kept in mind, and sometimes you do what you got to do. Here's another one. So this is a shockwave one. So whether you loved it or hated it, this was a cool explosion, right? So you've got that shockwave going through. You don't have the sound. There's no sound in here until towards the end when you see the second bolt, right? Sound right in there. But it's really, really, so this is about that shockwave, right, of energy. What I have found really interesting about this is it's actually an homage back to the original, right? So from A New Hope, with the second iteration of it, when they redid this, this is all new from the 77 release. So we have this explosion. So the narrative of the Star Wars universe is these circular explosive shockwaves that come out. And you see it used consistently throughout the film series, right? But it's a narrative element that's defined and utilized over and over again. This one's cool, right? So perceptual psychology of color. Human eye is hardwired to detect sudden contrast in brightness and hue. And beyond that, the human eye is also responsible for balancing color on you. So what happens, and I do this in a class that I teach, where if you stare at a certain color long enough and then you swap it out. So I usually have students stare at like a cyan circle for a long time, for like 15, 20 seconds, and then I shift it to a white circle. And what happens is there's this very, very brief moment where the white circle is pink because there's a magenta tone that's been introduced to it. So what happens is through your rods and cones in your eyes, there's a balance being struck, right? So as you're being inundated with a certain color, right, your eyes are balancing it by introducing the opposite. So magenta is the complement to cyan. So as you're inundated with cyan, your eyes are balancing with magenta. So for a split second after you switch from cyan to white or to another color, it is being influenced by another color. So that is used in explosions a lot because what normally precedes an explosion is a cool color, right? It's usually a blue, something along those levels. Then the explosion becomes warm, and that initial impact, that initial moment of the explosion is even brighter because it's augmented by your eyesight. And that's something film cannot do. We're helping them out. So I've always thought that was really cool. And this is a great example of it from The Incredibles. So we're inundated with this really blue tone, right? So our eyes are all kind of balancing. This little pop of red, right, start to increase that urgency, signifying something's going to happen. But because we get blue and then that red, that explosion can always, they can always make that explosion more prevalent. It's very, very cool. Simple color theory 101, warm colors, cool colors versus high contrast, right? So your warms are your reds, oranges, and yellows, cools are blues, teals, and violets. And then we can use some high contrast in here to help out the scenarios. So that Incredibles one we just looked at, there was quite a bit of high contrast employed. If you haven't seen, I know many of you have probably seen Logan. Just as an aside, if you can find Logan Noir, check it out, because it's basically a black and white version of Logan, but it's not just them making it black and white. It was designed to be black and white. Very, very cool. And that's the thing, right? Things designed with intent. I've often, I ask a lot of people, did you see the first Spider-Verse film? And everybody's like, yeah, I saw the first Spider-Verse film. My second question is always, did you see it in 3D in the theater? Because the 3D version of that, like stereo glasses in the theater, is a totally different experience than what you've seen on television, or even if you saw it theatrically, normal version without 3D. It was designed frame by frame. We had an individual that was brought in for that explicit purpose of designing every single shot for 3D, and it shows in that film. Same thing with Avatar, right? Avatar is designed 3D, whereas others, not so much. One thing we're going to look at just quickly, cinematic framing. So where the explosion takes place is also vital, okay? So if you're running low on resources, right, and maybe you can't render an entire explosion, you may consider fragments of that explosion, thinking about a felt explosion rather than a full-on explosion, part of the storytelling process, right? So you can use partial visibility. Negative space and contrast around that explosion become very important. The dark areas can emphasize the shape and the overall luminance in there. And negative space just gives it room to breathe and expand into and become part of. Using characters, foreground, background elements to really ground it, to create some emotional context with the explosion can also be really advantageous, as well as, you know, using light pulses or dynamic flickers to suggest energy without fire, right? So if you can take, everybody wants to throw everything at the explosion, right? You want fire, you want smoke, you want debris, you want all of this stuff in here. Every single one of those elements that we're trying to introduce is increasing your render times. Okay, so be aware of that. Is if you don't have that level of machine, you don't have the luxury. Like in the studio, I know we had access to render farms, and I could send a render to the queue and get it back in a couple of days and see what I needed to. That same rendering, if I was to try to do it on my machine that I'm sitting in front of, would take years to render, whereas we were doing it in a couple of days, right? I saw at one point, I saw a number where there was the rust effect in Alice in Wonderland, which is another amazing use of Houdini. The rust effect, if it was rendered on one machine, to try to the amount of time it would have taken to render that entire film on one machine, or that sequence on one machine, was 319 million hours. Okay, so you got to be smart about this. You do not have the resources that the large film studios have access to, but they almost expect you to have that level of quality. So you got to learn where to cut corners, when to use cards, when to use pops of flashes of light instead of actual fire, right? Where can you get away with not using some of those tiny things and maintaining the integrity and the design and the narrative of the explosion you're trying to communicate? It's about choreography. It's not necessarily about chaos, right? Impact isn't found in noise or destruction. It's in the precision, the artful balance of timing, framing, and scale. There's a rhythm. There has to be intention to it. Okay, so the timing of that explosion. So we've talked about ignition, we've talked about expansion, and we've talked about dissipation. This is the cinematic side of things, right? We have that anticipation. We have, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And then we've got that moment, that blinding light of the central moment, and then we've got the reaction afterwards. So you've got your anticipation, which builds the pressure. And oftentimes in demo reels, this is missing, right? Because contextually, time-wise, you haven't factored into it, but you need to build a little bit of that in. It's the same thing, right? On a modeling reel, you don't necessarily need to show your character in a pose, but it sure helps, right? You need to show wireframes, you need to show stuff like that, but same thing applies here with effects, right? With explosions, you should have that anticipation and the aftermath, where the focus most of the time is on the burst. It's on the actual event. But think about the other bookends to it, and your work and your reel will become way more successful. Here's an example. And you don't have the music, and the music is just so, it's like this violin concerto kind of thing. So it's this back and forth buildup, right? Lots of tension. And then that's it, right? That's it. That's the explosion, right? But a lot of the cinematics of this, like I wouldn't necessarily say this is a demo reel piece, right? Yeah, in IMAX, very, very cool, right? And I've really truncated it here. I've just shown basically that anticipation and then the burst. The burst goes on a little bit, right? There's a lot of cuts back and forth between reactions, and there's a heaviness to this moment, right? Everybody watching this who has ever lived under the threat of nuclear war kind of thing, right? This is the heaviness that was coming along with it. In the 80s, which is where when I was growing up, right, it was constantly there, right? That was the fear. We would have drills in school where we were, taught to go under our desks. What that was going to help with if there was a nuclear explosion, who knows? But I had that moment, right? We've all experienced that. So the film was feeding into that just as much as everything else. And you'll also notice that, Things like, remember I mentioned about blue for the explosion, right? There's not too much time for your eyes to kind of readjust to this blue, but they do slightly. So the first time you get to this point, now you're getting the accentuation of more magenta into this explosion. And this tone is closer to that color tone. So it's always cool stuff to think about. So as far as cinematic framing, the overall scale, wide shots are usually used to communicate more destruction, obviously. There's more awe to them. What we just saw there in Oppenheimer, those were more secluded. So we're talking about close-ups, right? And they can draw you in, right? And that's the moment that they were going for. They were not trying to accentuate that as a massive event. They were talking about a massive moment in time. And that moment demanded a bit more intimacy, which is what they achieved with that shot. Used together, wide and close perspective. So we saw that earlier with the Mr. and Mrs. Smith, right? The wide explosion, then the close-up for debris, so on and so forth, right? And this is just a cool one. Again, we see the result, the anticipation, the burst, the denouement, the after effects. Cool about this effect, everybody's like, wow, that's really cool. That was amazing. That was recorded in a water tank, right? Because they didn't want the material to be a standard explosion. They wanted it to have a different kind of an impact. So that's the other thing to think about when you're assessing what you're trying to do, right? Trying to be a little different is a great thing. Compositionally, you want to accentuate depth. You could utilize symmetry, but there's very few directors that could actually do symmetry well. Understand why symmetry doesn't work before you try to break that rule, whereas the rule of thirds oftentimes becomes a lot more aesthetically pleasing, and it's easier, right? You just figure out your thirds on your screen, and then that's where you want to place that primary ignition point. Balance, timing, scale, composition, turn, destruction, it's all about the design of it, right? Here's a great example from Spider-Verse. Cool. All right. So explosions are more than spectacles, as we've come to understand, right? They can be metaphorical. They can have narrative impact. This is you, right? None of this comes from the software. None of this is going to come from AI. It's all going to come from you, your investment into the moment, and your investment into understanding a lot of what we were talking about, or what I have been talking about today. So I'm going to take this back to Spider-Verse for just a second, right? So the next time you're watching, like, Across the Spider-Verse, Into Spider-Verse, or eventually when Beyond the Spider-Verse comes out someday, I think 2027, some things to look at, right? So scale and timing. How many layers? How fast are they expanding? Like, how are they broken up? I've given you a glimpse into the background of what happens there. Volume to graphic translation. So how do volumes, how are they flattened, right? How do they create that kind of an effect? Observation of 3D sim passes, 2D libraries, right? How are these things used, and how could you utilize them in your work? How could you make it even better? Color, right? Color contrast. This was brilliant from the second film, where it wasn't the Prowler, but it was Uncle Aaron does this punch, and this brilliant cascade of colors comes out of it. It's totally different from the rest of the film, but completely relevant to that world. Art direction of debris, right? So don't forget about the debris. Even if sometimes it's easier to do a cutaway, right? If you do the initial explosion and then you want to show the aftermath, do a cutaway to another shot where you have the opportunity to introduce elements, right? So maybe you've blown up an outhouse and you want to throw in a sink kind of thing. I don't know. I'm just playing off the cuff here. But don't always think that these events, even though they play out sequentially in a film, they don't have to necessarily all exist in the same scene, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And stylization, right? Even for the realistic stuff, for the believable, realistic stuff, it's okay to introduce stylization. In fact, that's where you're going to put your personal touch onto it. It goes beyond simulation and it becomes artistic expression, which is what you're really trying to do here. So at Think Tank, I think a couple of my students or the students of the program are in the class or in this meeting, so that's great. I didn't get an opportunity to put an exact name to every piece, but it's these are all some of the graduates from the last couple of classes, and they've just done sensational work with explosions, and they've put a lot of thought into what we were just talking about. Yeah, some very, very cool work there. The last thing I'm going to say is working in Houdini, working on explosions or effects of any kind is as much about the journey as it is about the destination. So you want to ensure that you are documenting, you're keeping track of your approach to doing things, because anybody you talk to in an interview they're going to geek out on this stuff, right? They're going to have maybe had similar times when that they've dealt with that same problem, and they want to know how you handled it. They want to know how you approached it, right? Which is the unique feature that you're bringing to the job. So don't discount that. Keep it documented, include it in your demonstration of your skills and your talents, and even showing some of this stuff that, Sony does this in their reels all the time to accentuate, to demonstrate to future how they want to bid stuff out, right? That they can do this at a crazy level. So keep that in mind for your reels. And that's it. That's all I got for you.